Welcome, everybody, to what promises to be a very informative and meaningful half hour or so, where we're going to engage in some very special hasbara, explanation, understanding of the current crisis in Israel. A couple of years ago in Mill Hill Synagogue, I, together with Orly Rosenlang, set up what we call the Israel Engagement Hub, which enables us to engage with unique personalities across the world to give people better insight into what's really going on in Israel. And I'm delighted that tonight I'm able to be joined with Michael Freeman. Michael saw firsthand what was going on at the Israel Engagement Hub at the Mill Hill Synagogue in London, but himself has led a very illustrious career in all forms of Israeli politics. He currently serves as the policy advisor to the foreign ministry in Israel, and it is really my true delight and honor that he's able to spare some time at this moment in time to share with me this evening. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael to join me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back, but not really physically, but at least online.
It's really great to see you, Michael, and I'm extremely appreciative. I mean, these they are particularly hectic times, and for yourself in the firing line, and I've seen already numerous clips of you on various different news stations. You are clearly in the face of all kinds of hostility. You are batting away the balls, as they say, quite admirably. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to also add some clarity for the benefit of the many here in the UK this evening who might in fact be watching or will be watching after the fact. So thank you very much in the first instance for agreeing to join. I suppose it makes sense to jump right in and just simply explain how all this kicked off. I mean, there was, according to reports, a court ruling sanctioning eviction from homes in East Jerusalem. At the same time, again, according to reports, there was interruption to the final day of Ramadan, including the storming of the AlAqsa Mosque. I mean, what's going on?
So I think firstly, it's important to separate some of these issues and separate all the issues, because ultimately, what we're seeing at the moment, the Hamas firing of rockets, has got nothing to do with what was going on in Jerusalem or these other incidents that were happening. But what we're seeing at the moment, and I will deal with the two incidents in Jerusalem, but what we're seeing at the moment is a premeditated decision by Hamas. After we saw the Palestinian elections, which were cancelled, Hamas decided that they want to try and take control of the Palestinian agenda. And they decided to do that by firing rockets on Jerusalem and firing rockets on Israel. And the issue of Sheikh Jarrah and the issue of Ramadan and the Temple Mount and the AlAqsa Mosque and all of those were just this week's convenient excuse for them to launch their attack on Israel. So I think it's important we separate. I'm happy to talk about those specific issues because they're obviously dealt with in the media. But I think it's really vital at the initial part to separate them out because one is not connected to the other except in the media.
Okay, fair enough. So can you just share with us what happened, particularly the AlAqsa Mosque?
So look, the AlAqsa Mosque, since 1967, since Israel's had sovereignty over Jerusalem and over the whole of Jerusalem, we've guaranteed freedom of prayer, freedom of worship, freedom of access for all religions, including Muslims and including Christians and Jews and all religions. And every year, hundreds of thousands of Muslims go up to the Temple Mount and they pray during Ramadan, and they do so peacefully. And for some reason, this year, that was different, that a small group of extremists, of radicals, decided that they were going to use the AlAqsa Mosque as an opportunity and Ramadan as an opportunity to throw stones and throw rocks on Jewish worshippers who were downstairs, who were down below at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. And they gathered all these rocks, all these stones inside the AlAqsa Mosque. They gathered fireworks, they gathered flares, and they simply started causing a riot and throwing them on Jewish worshippers below. And so the police decided that they were going to move in order to restore law and order. And in doing so, you saw the pictures of the police going in, firing the stun grenades, doing what they were doing because they were being pelted with rock, stones, and flares. And again, this was agitated by Hamas as part of the idea to try and heat up the ground, to try and create a riot based on the fact that they want to try and take control of the agenda in Jerusalem after the cancellation of the Palestinian elections.
So in other words, it was all part of the bigger scheme of Hamas. Do this, we know how Israel will react. That'll then give us the excuse to retaliate in a bigger way.
Well, yes, and if it wouldn't have been that, they'd have found something different. It wasn't a case of that. It wasn't a case of the AlAqsa Mosque. And again, I would say to anybody, even if you think Israeli police overreacted, and to be clear, I don't, it doesn't give you an excuse to fire rockets. There's no justification to fire rockets on a civilian population. And the minute that you say it's okay to fire rockets, you're justifying attacking a civilian population for any reason that you just happen to decide one day.
Okay, so we know the argument. Israel, of course, has to defend itself against the rockets. Any country, of course, would. But what of the argument that the response is completely disproportionate?
Well, I would say that's obviously, I would say that's absolutely not true. And I would say it for the following reasons. We've now faced, just to give you some numbers, over 4,000 rockets have now been fired into Israel. Israel have carried out approximately 1,000 strikes into Gaza. Each one of those has been carefully coordinated and carefully targeted in order to try and destroy Hamas's network to stop them being able to fire rockets on Israel again. This is about trying to stop those rockets and to stop Hamas's military network working. Unfortunately, Hamas deliberately hide behind civilians. They deliberately hide their weapons next to schools, next to hospitals, within houses, within buildings that are civilian infrastructure, knowing that no matter how hard we try, and we do everything we can, including calling people in advance of their strike, including calling off, numerous strikes have been called off because of civilians in the area. They know that it's inevitable that unfortunately civilians will be there if you surround yourself with civilians. You know, we say Israel uses our weapons to protect our civilians. Hamas use civilians to protect their weapons.
Right. You know, it's interesting. In America, there's something called the felony murder rule, which means if you shoot at a policeman who responds and inadvertently hits somebody else and kills them, then you, who created the dangerous scenario, are actually the one ultimately responsible. I guess how much more so when you choose to use them as human shields in the first instance. But then I guess it begs the question, is the media really so oblivious to this? Does the world really not know? It's quite blatant, is it not?
Well, look, no matter how much we may be right, ultimately there are innocents dying, and there are innocents dying on both sides. You know, but ultimately when you see children dying, you don't go into details to know, look, by the way, 20 to 25% of all the rockets that Hamas have fired, we know over 800 rockets that Hamas have fired have landed in the Gaza Strip. And we know that they've killed women and children, and they've killed innocents from the Hamas rockets. But when you're in the Gaza Strip and you're seeing pictures of bodies of children, and you're seeing that dynamic taking place, then it's very difficult to see the bigger picture, because ultimately, before I'm an Israeli, before I'm a Jew, before I'm a Palestinian, we're all human beings. And human beings seeing other human beings die is a very emotive and difficult dynamic, which often takes away from the bigger picture of the understanding.
And yet the uprising, literally, like flash paper, like literally all around the world, many people really that naive, that misinformed, university campuses, as you know all too well, have become hostile environments. Jews don't feel safe walking the streets, whether in LA or in London, having in fact been attacked. To me, it only proves that so-called anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are really one and the same. What's your view on that?
Well, I do strongly believe that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are one and the same. If you believe that every nation, every people in the right have the right to self-determination, except for the Jews, then that's a clear statement of how you feel about Jews. If every other nation and people can have the right, why can't the Jews have the right to self-determination as well? So if you're fundamentally against our right, then there's a double standard there, and a double standard against Jews has a name. But I would also say, I think if I was at this moment a Syrian Muslim, or if I was an Afghani Muslim, I think I would be particularly upset and start asking myself the question, does my life matter less than everybody else? Because we've seen tens of thousands of Syrian Muslims butchered over the years. We've seen thousands of Afghani Muslims butchered, and yet there's no one marching down the streets across the world. There's not hundreds of thousands of people in London or thousands of people anywhere else in the world marching around saying we need to deal with this. But for some reason, when it's Israel who responds to thousands of rockets, they're out on the streets. And it always makes me wonder why.
Fair point. But here's a bit more of a contentious question. Doesn't Israel, for the first time possibly, have an altogether different problem right now? arguably unprecedented because there's clearly some uprising within Israel itself, chaos on its own streets. Surely that must be deeply troubling.
Look, that's incredibly troubling. And ultimately, we know that Hamas is starting to stir some of that up. But seeing Israeli Jews and seeing Israeli Arabs fighting and on streets is deeply troubling. And it's something that has been condemned across the board within Israeli politics, from the left to the right, from the Arab parties to the Jewish parties. And thankfully, over the last couple of days, we've seen that start to come under control. But it's certainly deeply worrying. And it's something that when this conflict is over and when there's a ceasefire, it's something that as Israeli society, we're going to need to deal with. We're going to need to look at, see what some of those causes are and start to tackle them in a serious way.
Because people are in fact saying that maybe against Hamas, Israel is winning the battle, but in the bigger scheme of things, with what is going on in Israel itself now, they are effectively losing the war.
Well, I think that it's brought forward some issues, but again, we need to remember this is a minority. This is a tiny, tiny minority of people who are engaged in this violence. And we're also seeing the other side of Israel. We're seeing some amazing unity programs. We're seeing people working together. We're seeing, very, very different side of Israel. I mean, after the tragedy at Meron, which, we've forgotten was only a couple of weeks ago, but we saw Israeli society coming together in a way that is the polar opposite of what we've seen during the last couple of days inside. One example that those people who were returning from Meron after the tragedy, after the disaster, the Arab villages in the north, they opened their gates to them. They opened their homes, even though it was Ramadan and they were fasting. They provided food and they provided water to all of those people who were returning. And we saw these amazing scenes of solidarity. We saw people going to visit them, Muslims and Jews and Christians, all visiting the Shiva calls to people who died. And I think that is a much greater and truer reflection of Israeli society than the crazy minority who've been doing what they're doing.
Okay. Now, as someone working high up in the Foreign Office in Israel, would you agree that what happens in Israel spills over into the diaspora? Or to put the question differently, I mean, to what extent, if any, does Israel concern itself with that? They know that when something happens there, Jews are going to get beaten up somewhere else. Is it a case of, that's not our problem, your government should protect you against that? Or does that tend to get taken into consideration?
Our priority, obviously, is to stop rockets falling on Israeli towns and Israeli cities so that people can go to bed at night and they can be safe and they don't have to run every couple of hours to a bomb shelter. My wife's father, my father-in-law, 84 years old in Ashkelon, he, for the last 10 days, pretty much hasn't come out of his bomb shelter because of the number of rockets. We know that, unfortunately, there will always be people who decide that this will be their excuse to attack Jews. But a Jew in the UK is not responsible, or anywhere else in the world, is not responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. The Israeli government is responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. And if somebody is going to attack a Jew, then again, I think this is the excuse they've looked for, because ultimately we're basing that this is based on pure anti-Semitism. And we certainly would expect, and we're seeing, the governments around the world to deal with that and to stop that anti-Semitism. Obviously, for Israel, we care about our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, and we would do everything we can to help. And certainly we've seen the foreign minister and other ministers in the government speak out about the wave of anti-Semitism that's taking place and encourage governments to do things about that. But ultimately, the Jews around the world are citizens of their countries, and we don't have any authority over them. We don't want authority over them. And in the same way that we're not responsible for them, they're not responsible for our actions either.
Fair enough. Now, as you know, Israel Engagement Hub, it's been running for a number of years, and Orly and I have been working hard to try and just bring the bigger picture of Israel to the wider society. But I think the greatest victims in mainstream Anglo Jewry would be university students. Virtually every campus has become toxic. And in fact, many a professor has joined the bandwagon. Jewish students feel unsafe, and that's putting it mildly. I know you did a lot of work with campuses when you were here in the UK. What would your advice be to university students, your top tips for them?
So I think my advice to university students would be, firstly, to understand the situation that's going on in Israel. The more you understand, I think the more you feel confident. I think that you also need to try and decide what your message is, what you feel confident with. No one wants a university student on campus to be a spokesperson for the Israeli government. That's not their role. That's not what we want from them. We want them to be proud Jews. We want them to be proud Zionists. We want them to be proud of their connections. And I think that as Jews on campus, they should work together. As Zionists, they should work together. There are plenty of people, I think the majority of students on campus, who are very much understand the Israeli situation. They understand the dynamic. And I think that if students explain what's going on in a simple way they possibly can, then I think that helps them. But I think they would also need to work with you, Jess. They need to work with the various different campus organizations, pro-Israel organizations that are out there, that the shuls can give them backing. And they should work with them to feel secure on campus. Nobody should feel on a campus in the UK ashamed or upset of their identity, of who they are. And I think that engaging students on a one-on-one level and talking to their friends, I think they'd be surprised at how open people are to listening, because ultimately Hamas are a radical Islamist terror organization. And I know that in Britain, people understand what a radical Islamist terror organization is, because Britain's faced radical Islamist terror organizations. And when people explain that on a simple level, I think that people understand it and it helps them. And I think that every Jew and Zionist on campus needs to find the level they're happy with, to get engaged, to work as much as they possibly can. But under no circumstances should you ever, I think, feel scared and hide your identity and hide who you are. People respect you for being who you are and for saying what you believe in.
As they like to say here in England, hear, hear. But if Hamas really is the problem, indeed they are a terrorist organization, and we know their charter is to call for the eradication of Israel, full stop, why do we keep pulling back from the brink? If we could eliminate them, or most of them, wouldn't that enable a more stable and peaceful setting? And we're going to have another ceasefire, and then what?
Well, look, a ceasefire in itself is not an aim, as you say. There's no reason to have a ceasefire by itself. We need to make sure that any halt in the fighting is a sustained pause. We don't want a band-aid solution. We don't want to stick a plaster on it and say, okay, that'll do. It needs to be long-term. But we also don't want to be going into Gaza again. We don't want to be occupying Gaza. We withdrew in 2005 because we didn't want to control over lives of the people in Gaza and the Palestinians. And we have to hope that the Palestinians will find for themselves new leadership. Hamas are destroying Palestinians. As much as we're seeing what they're doing to Israel, it's the Palestinians who are suffering. You know, we spoke earlier about the children who have been killed, but the rest of the children there have got no future. They've got no hope. They've got nothing to look forward to, because Hamas are robbing them of their childhood. They're robbing them of their future. So I think we have to hope that the moderate Palestinians will come forward. And I do believe the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza want a better future. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're controlled over by a radical terror organization. And I think it's also the responsibility on all the countries in the world who want to see stability in the Middle East, who want to see peace, to discourage Hamas, to undermine Hamas, to designate them as a terror organization, and work to make sure that their leaders can't go anywhere, their leaders can't get funding, to cut out their ability to operate as they are, and to hopefully the Palestinians will bring a new leadership in.
Well, you mentioned other countries around the world to facilitate that process. I mean, the United States has vacillated to one extent or another in its support for Israel. You might say, arguably, the Trump era lent its full support. And you might say, arguably, that many felt more betrayed by the Obama administration. As a high-ranking member of the foreign ministry, where are we now with the Biden government? I mean, they did call for a de-escalation, but we're fighting terror.
Well, the Biden administration, President Biden and Secretary Blinken have been incredibly supportive of Israel. They've been very, very clear that they support our right to self-defense. They've condemned the rocket fire from Hamas. They've called on it to stop unconditionally. And they've supported our right to defend our citizens unconditionally. I know that the foreign minister has spoken with Secretary Blinken a number of times. The prime minister has spoken with President Biden a number of times. And I can tell you that those meetings have been very, very warm conversations, and that they have been incredibly, incredibly supportive of what goes on in Israel. And I've got no concerns or any worries whatsoever about the relationship between Israel and America and between the president and between the administration. They're incredibly supportive, and I think that we'll see that over the coming weeks, months, and years.
That's actually very encouraging to hear. So let me finish with a final question. It's been 2 weeks. Is there an end in sight, or does it just end when Hamas runs out of rockets?
No, I hope that there will be a ceasefire soon. I hope, and I'm encouraged, and I think that it's very possible we will see a cease to the fighting very soon. We've certainly degraded Hamas's capabilities in a very, very significant way. We've destroyed huge numbers of their rockets. We've destroyed huge numbers, and more significantly, their factories to produce those rockets. We've done significant damage to that. We've destroyed a lot of their command and control centers. We've destroyed a lot of their tunnel network. The tunnel network runs under Gaza. We've done a lot of damage to that. We have eliminated a number of their leadership and a number of their soldiers, and they've really been degraded in a very significant extent. So I am hopeful. I think that one of the other questions that the world needs to be asking and looking at all the time is, you know, all of these things that I've spoken about, their command and control centers, their rockets, their underground tunnels, all of that cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to build. And they have received billions of dollars of aid. And the question is, and I think the question that the world needs to ask is, why are Hamas spending their money on rockets and on tunnels and on armory, rather than spending it on schools, on hospitals, on COVID vaccinations, on the future of their population? And the sad thing is that we're seeing Hamas destroying the future of the Palestinian people, because for them, the hate of Israel and the hate of Jews all around the world trumps everything and is more important. So on the one side of things, we've degraded. The ideology is still there. And I am hopeful that any ceasefire, which I believe will come soon, will give us a sustained period of calm. And then we need to work with international partners to make sure that we don't have another flare-up, hopefully ever, and that we start to work with the Gaza on a better future for the Palestinians there.
Michael, it's always fascinating to listen to you. We can go on for hours, but I am especially grateful. I know life is hectic at the moment, that you've taken out the time from family and politics to be able to share with us. I am truly grateful, and thank you. Stay safe, and here's hoping, please God, for peace soon enough.
Thank you very much indeed for having me, and I hope that I managed to give a different perspective.
Most definitely so, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.